So right now, as you're listening to this, you are probably sitting in a chair or, maybe you're walking around and you feel the solid ground right there beneath your feet.
Right, you feel gravity holding you down.
Yeah, exactly. You feel the weight of your own body. And you probably just assume, like we all do, that the world around you is stable. You assume it's continuous.
Which is totally natural. I mean, that's just how human perception works.
Right. But what if I told you that over 1,000 years ago, a group of really brilliant thinkers systematically, and I mean logically, argued that your chair and the ground and even your own body doesn't actually exist for more than a fraction of a microsecond at a time?
Yeah, it's a wild thought.
It really is. What if this continuous reality is just a complete illusion and everything around you is basically flashing into and out of existence, frame by frame, held together by some external will?
I mean, it is honestly one of the most staggering concepts in all of intellectual history.
Yeah.
Because we look around and we see permanent objects.
Mhm.
We see unbroken physical laws.
Right.
We see cause and effect. But the thinkers we are exploring today, they looked at that exact same universe and concluded that a permanent physical law is, well, it's a logical impossibility.
And that is why we are here today. Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. We have an incredibly ambitious mission for this one.
We really do.
We're looking at a stack of historical and philosophical notes, and we are primarily drawing from Majid Fakhry's book, A History of Islamic Philosophy. We want to explore this epic, centuries-long intellectual collision.
Yeah, and it really was a collision.
It was fierce. It was this foundational struggle between pure rational philosophy, which was mostly imported from the ancient Greeks, and religious dogma in the Islamic world during the 8th to 12th centuries.
And, we should probably clarify early on for you listening, we are not here to debate the theology itself or, take sides on who is technically right.
Oh, definitely not. No taking sides here. We're just looking at what the sources say.
Exactly. Our goal is to unpack the mechanics of this debate. Because when you look closely at how these two worldviews collided, you start to realize they were wrestling with the exact same questions that modern physics, and especially quantum mechanics, wrestle with today.
Which is mind-blowing.
Right, like what is time, what is causality? Do we actually have free will? Or is the universe just strictly determined?
I think when people hear, 8th century theology, they immediately imagine dusty scrolls. They imagine blind, unquestioning dogma.
Right, just religious clerics covering their ears and shouting down the scientists.
Yeah, exactly. But the reality is just so much stranger and honestly so much more rigorous than that.
Oh, absolutely.
The theologians we're looking at today, they didn't just reject philosophy. They realized that if they wanted to defeat the philosophers, they had to steal their tools.
They had to beat them at their own game.
Yes.
Yeah.
They used rigorous Greek logic to build this mind-bending, almost quantum version of physics just to protect their view of an all-powerful God.
So to set the stage for how this all started, we really have to look at the intellectual climate of the Abbasid Caliphate, right around the 8th and 9th centuries.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Well, the Muslim world had expanded incredibly rapidly.
Yeah.
And as it expanded, it was encountering cultures that had deeply ingrained philosophical traditions.
Especially the stuff coming from ancient Greece.
Right, thinkers like Aristotle and Plato. And there was this massive translation movement happening at the time. All these Greek philosophical and scientific texts were being translated directly into Arabic.
So you have this huge flood of newly imported logic pouring into places like Baghdad and Basra.
Exactly. And it sparks a completely new spirit of inquiry. But it also creates a major, major divide.
A profound cleavage, really. Because on one side, you have the systematic philosophers, guys like al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, who's also known as Avicenna in the West.
Right, and they were just captivated by this Greek thought. They fully bought in.
They really did. They believed the universe was logical, ordered, and that it operated on eternal mechanical laws. And they basically spent their time trying to harmonize this Aristotelian mechanical universe with Islamic thought.
And then, on the exact opposite side, you had the traditionalists. And they looked at this Greek logic and saw it as a massive threat.
A threat to what, exactly?
A threat to the concept of an all-powerful, active creator. Because if the universe runs on autopilot, what does God actually do?
Right, that's a huge problem for them. But there was a group caught right in the middle of this, wasn't there? The Mu'tazila.
Yeah, the Mu'tazila are essential to this whole story. They were a school of Islamic theology, but they were essentially the rationalists of the theological world.
So they liked reason.
Oh, they loved reason. They fully embraced Greek dialectic methods, and their absolute core belief was in the unqualified absolute justice of God.
Okay, that sounds pretty standard for theology.
It does, but here is the catch. They believed that God's justice had to make perfect rational sense to the human mind.
Wait, meaning they tried to hold God to a human standard of fairness?
Precisely. They argued that, if God is just, he absolutely must reward the good and punish the wicked.
Okay.
Therefore, logically, humans must have absolute free will to choose good or evil, because otherwise God punishing them for something they had no control over would be logically unfair.
I see. So they basically built a theological system that prioritized human, rational concepts of morality over the absolute, unconstrained power of God.
Exactly. And that sets up our first major turning point. Because to understand how the traditional theologians eventually fought back against all this rationalism, we have to look at a man who started on the inside.
Right, a man who actually defected from the Mu'tazila camp, Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari.
And al-Ash'ari, he wasn't just some fringe student sitting in the back of the class. He was deeply, deeply embedded in the Mu'tazilite establishment.
He studied under the head of their Basra branch, right?
Yeah.
A very prominent scholar named al-Jubai.
Yes. And by the time al-Ash'ari was 40 years old, he was a highly respected, fully established thinker in this rationalist tradition.
40 years old. I mean, think about that. That's a point in life where most people are deeply entrenched in their worldview. You don't just pivot your entire career and ideology on a whim at 40.
No, you really don't. But the historical accounts note this dramatic, sudden shift.
Yeah, the story goes that he had a dream of the Prophet Muhammad during the month of Ramadan, and this dream basically urged him to abandon the rationalist school and defend the traditional faith.
And whatever the actual internal psychological mechanism was that caused it, the external result was explosive.
Oh, it was a huge scene.
He didn't just quietly resign and walk away. He went to the main mosque in Basra. He literally climbed the pulpit, and he publicly repudiated his former beliefs right there in front of everyone.
He declared to the whole congregation that he was stripping off his old Mu'tazilite beliefs as easily as taking off his clothes.
Which is quite the image.
It really is. And he dedicated the rest of his life to dismantling the very rationalist system he had spent decades helping to build.
And you have to realize, he knew exactly where all the structural weaknesses were, because he was one of the architects. He helped build the building.
Which brings us to this legendary debate. Now, whether this debate happened exactly as it was recorded, or if it was sort of formulated later as a brilliant parable to illustrate his defection, it doesn't really matter.
Right, the logic of it is what matters.
Because it perfectly captures the fatal flaw he found in his former teacher's logic. It's known as the debate of the three brothers.
Oh, it is just a masterclass in philosophical entrapment. The entire premise targets the Mu'tazila's core claim that God's justice aligns perfectly with human rational fairness.
Okay, let's unpack this for you listening, because it is so clever. So al-Ash'ari approaches his old master, al-Jubai, and he proposes a hypothetical scenario.
Right.
He says, okay, three brothers die. Brother number one lived a really long life, was incredibly righteous, and died in a state of absolute grace. Brother number two lived a similarly long life, but was deeply wicked. He was just a bad guy, and he died in a state of sin.
Okay, the sinner.
And then there's brother number three. He died as an innocent child, having never reached the age where he could actually commit either good or evil deeds. So al-Ash'ari asks his master, what is the fate of these three brothers in the afterlife?
So al-Jubai, the master, answers exactly according to strict rationalist doctrine. He says, well, the righteous brother goes to paradise because he earned it. The wicked brother goes to hell, having earned it.
Makes sense so far.
Right. And the child, having earned neither reward nor punishment, goes to an intermediate state of neither joy nor suffering.
Which, on a surface human level seems totally fair.
It does.
But this is where al-Ash'ari starts to tighten the net. He asks his master, okay, but what if the child in the intermediate state asks God, Lord, why didn't you let me live longer so I could do good deeds and join my righteous brother in paradise?
And al-Jubai, who is trying to stay true to his logical framework of God's omniscience and mercy, replies that God would say, I knew that if you had grown up, you would have become a sinner and ended up in hell. So I took your life early as an act of mercy just to spare you from damnation.
And boom, this is where the trap snaps shut. Al-Ash'ari delivers the fatal blow to the whole system.
That's so...
He asks his master, if God says that to the child, what happens when the wicked brother, who is currently burning in hell, hears this explanation?
Right.
The wicked brother would cry out, Lord, you knew I was going to sin too. Why didn't you take my life as a child out of that exact same mercy and spare me this torment?
And the historical texts report that al-Jubai was utterly silenced by this.
I mean, what can you even say? The rational framework just collapses on itself.
Because there was no logical answer. If you try to say God is perfectly omniscient and perfectly just according to human standards, the system creates these impossible paradoxes.
It totally exposes the arrogance of trying to squeeze an infinite being into a finite human conceptual box called fairness.
That was exactly al-Ash'ari's conclusion. He realized that projecting human morality onto God was a fundamental structural error.
So what does he do?
He pivots to a completely new doctrine.
Hey.
He asserts that God's decrees are entirely independent of any conditions. God is the absolute sovereign, period.
Yeah, the notes we have describe his view on injustice, which is just wild to think about. He argues that the word injustice literally just means transgressing the law of a superior.
Right.
Like, if I break the law, I'm unjust because the state is superior to me. But since God has no superior and he makes the laws, it is metaphysically impossible for God to be unjust. Whatever God does is, by definition, just.
It's a system of divine command theory taken to its absolute limit.
Yeah.
I mean, to al-Ash'ari, the rationalists were essentially bordering on polytheism.
Wait, polytheism? How so?
Well, by claiming that humans are the independent creators of their own actions, just so they could have free will. They were implying that there are millions of little creators running around the universe right alongside God.
Oh, wow, I see.
Yeah. And al-Ash'ari insisted there is only one creator, and his eternal power brings everything into existence, and that includes human actions.
Okay, I hear what you're saying about protecting God's uniqueness, but if I'm listening to this, I'm hitting pause right now.
Oh, sure.
Because if God creates every single action, and I don't create my own actions, aren't humans just puppets?
It definitely sounds like it.
Right, like we're just acting out a script we didn't write. If God preordains and actually creates the act of someone committing a crime, how in the world does the human get punished for it? That sounds like a cosmic dictatorship, where the dictator forces you to commit the crime and then throws you in jail for it.
You've hit on the exact theological crisis that al-Ash'ari had to resolve. He had to figure this out, because he couldn't accept the rationalists saying man creates his own acts, but he also couldn't accept extreme fatalism.
Right, where humans are just rocks rolling down a hill.
Exactly, because that nullifies moral responsibility entirely. So he had to thread a nearly invisible needle. And his solution was this highly nuanced concept of al-Khazba.
Al-Khaz. The notes translate this as acquisition. Let's try to unravel this for everyone.
Okay, so the core distinction al-Ash'ari makes is between eternal power and created power.
Eternal versus created.
Right. God possesses eternal power, and only eternal power can actually bring something out of non-existence into existence. So God creates the action. The human being, on the other hand, possesses only created power, which cannot bring a new reality into existence.
Okay, following you so far.
But when God creates the action in the human being, the human acquires the action through their created power.
I'm really struggling to see the difference between that and just being a puppet. I mean, what does acquiring actually mean if I didn't generate the act myself?
It's tricky. Let's move away from modern corporate analogies of CEOs and middle managers, and let's think about it in terms of physics and experience.
Okay.
Imagine a sailboat on the ocean. The wind is God's eternal power. Without the wind, the boat absolutely cannot move.
Right, it's just stuck there.
And the sailor cannot summon the wind. The wind is a force entirely outside the sailor's creation. But the sailor can angle the sail.
Oh, I see where this is going.
By angling the sailor acquires the kinetic energy of the wind.
Okay, so the motion of the boat is entirely created by the wind, but the sailor takes on the characteristic of sailing by positioning themselves in relation to it.
Exactly. And al-Ash'ari grounds this heavily in actual human consciousness. He points out that you, as a human, you intuitively know the difference between a voluntary action and an involuntary one.
Sure.
Like if your hand tremors due to an illness, you know you aren't doing it. You feel completely passive. But if you reach out and pick up a cup of coffee, you feel a sense of agency. You experience the choice.
Even though metaphysically speaking, God is the one rendering the action of the arm moving and the fingers grasping.
Yes, exactly. Al-Ash'ari argues that this internal consciousness of choice, this feeling of voluntary action, is what constitutes al-Khaz.
So you acquire the moral weight of the deed because you are the willing locus of it.
Right? Even if God's eternal power is the engine making it happen, you get the credit or the blame because you acquired it.
Man, it's such a linguistic and psychological workaround. It preserves God's absolute monopoly on power while simultaneously preserving the human experience of guilt or merit.
It is. And if someone were to press al-Ash'ari and say, you know, that still doesn't make pure logical sense. How can God create the acts, but I get the blame? Al-Ash'ari would invoke his famous formula, bila kaifa.
Ila kaifa, which translates to ask not how,
Yes.
which honestly sounds like the ultimate cop-out. It sounds like a parent telling a kid, because I said so.
It's really easy to read it that way. But within the context of his philosophy, it wasn't a retreat into blind ignorance. You have to remember, al-Ash'ari was a master of logic.
True, he was a trained rationalist.
Right. He used the rigorous dialectical methods of the rationalists to systematically demonstrate the boundaries of human reason. Bila kaifa is actually the conclusion of a profound skepticism about the capacity of our finite brains to comprehend the infinite.
So it's not just shut up and believe.
No, it is a highly sophisticated, qualified agnosticism. He's basically saying, look, we have proven logically that our logic fails right here. We experience moral responsibility, and revelation dictates God's absolute power. Both must be true, but the mechanism connecting them is just beyond the physical capacity of human comprehension. Therefore, accept it without asking how.
He literally used logic to build a cage for logic. That is so brilliant.
It really is.
So al-Ash'ari establishes this theology of absolute divine power in the early 10th century. But the followers who came after him, the Asharite theologians, they realized they had left a massive flank exposed.
Oh, a glaring vulnerability in the realm of natural philosophy.
Right, because they had this new theology where God micromanages every single action, every leaf falling, every human thought, but they were still living in a world that was intellectually dominated by ancient Greek physics.
And Aristotelian physics operates heavily on the idea of inherent natures.
Yeah, let's clarify that for the listener. Aristotle believed that objects have internal properties that dictate how they behave, right?
Right. Fire burns because it has the nature of heat. A rock falls because it has a nature that seeks the center of the universe.
So in this view, nature basically runs on its own internal software, completely independent of any divine intervention.
And if Aristotle is right about that, then objects have independent power. And if a rock has independent power to fall, then God isn't absolutely powerful.
Huh. And the Ash'arites couldn't tolerate that.
Not for a second. They needed a physics that destroyed independent nature and made every millisecond of reality utterly dependent on God.
So they invented something astonishing. They built a metaphysical framework that sounds bizarrely like a modern digital simulation.
We're talking about the Asharite doctrine of atoms and occasionalism.
Yes, let's get into this.
To dismantle Greek causality, they looked at the entire universe and divided it into two strict categories: God, who is eternal, and the world, which is created.
Okay.
And the world, they argued, is composed entirely of two fundamental building blocks: atoms and accidents.
Now, we need to be very careful here because when we say atom in this context, we aren't talking about protons and electrons.
Right.
And when we say accident, we aren't talking about, a car crash.
Exactly. We have to strip away the modern definitions. In this philosophical context, an atom is the absolute smallest indivisible unit of space. Just a singular point of substance.
And an accident.
An accident is a quality or a property that exists in or on that atom.
Like the color red, or the state of being hot, or motion, or even the scent of a flower?
Yes. The atom is the blank canvas, and the accident is the paint.
That's a really helpful visualization, but here is the radical twist the Ash'arites introduced, the concept that completely obliterates Aristotelian physics.
This is where it gets crazy.
That they posited that accidents are inherently perishable. By definition, an accident cannot endure for two successive moments of time.
Let's make sure that really lands for people listening. They argued that the qualities of an object, its color, its temperature, its physical shape, do not last. They flash into existence, and in the next infinitesimal fraction of a second, they perish into absolute nothingness. They vanish the very instant they are created.
So if I'm holding a red apple right now and the accident of redness perishes instantly, why am I still seeing a red apple a second later? Why doesn't it just disappear?
Because of the relentless, exhausting, active intervention of God. God must constantly, continually recreate the universe, atom by atom, accident by accident, moment by moment. The apple is red in frame 1 because God created the accident of redness. In frame 2, the redness dies, and God instantaneously creates a new accident of redness.
This is exactly like a video game rendering engine.
It really is.
A video game running at 60 frames per second isn't a continuous reality. The computer draws a frame, throws it away, and then draws a slightly different frame a fraction of a second later to create the illusion of a solid world.
The Asherites essentially argued that God is the cosmic rendering engine running the universe frame by frame.
And it gets even more radical than just colors and heat, right?
Oh, yeah. It's not just qualities like that. The Asherites categorized duration itself as an accident.
Wait, let me get this straight. Existing through time is just another temporary quality.
Yes. The atom has no inherent ability to survive from one second to the next on its own. God has to actively apply the accident of duration to every single atom in the universe in every single microsecond.
That is heavy.
So if God decides he wants to annihilate your red apple, he doesn't have to summon a cosmic hammer to smash it.
He just stops rendering it. He takes his finger off the button for one frame, he stops supplying the accident of duration, and the apple just defaults back into absolute non-existence.
Exactly. It portrays a universe of ultimate, terrifying contingency. Absolutely nothing has permanence or power in and of itself.
Everything is just suspended over the infinite void of non-existence.
Right, held up only by the direct, momentary will of the Creator. And you can see how perfectly this served their theology. It strips nature of any independent power and gives total, unbroken sovereignty back to God.
It's beautiful in a really terrifying way. But, I see a massive mechanical problem here, and the notes indicate the Islamic theologians struggled with this too.
The problem of motion.
Yeah. If reality is literally just discrete, frozen frames flashing one after another, and space is made of discrete atomic points, how does anything actually move?
It's a huge issue. It's essentially Zeno's paradox reimagined for Islamic theology. If time and space are just a series of isolated dots, continuous, smooth motion should be impossible.
Because if an atom is at point A in frame 1 and it's moving to point C in frame 2, does it ever pass through point B? If reality isn't continuous, there's no actual time to pass through the space between.
Right. And one thinker, al-Mazam, he proposed a startling workaround for this called the tafra, which translates to the leap.
The leap.
He argued that a body could move from point A to point C without ever passing through the intermediary point B. It essentially bypasses the intervening space entirely.
It just teleports.
It is a literal quantum leap. He was arguing for non-continuous movement centuries before modern quantum mechanics observed electrons jumping between energy states without occupying the space in between.
That is honestly mind-bending. But the more orthodox Asherites, they had a slightly different explanation for motion, didn't they?
Yes, they sort of streamlined it. To the mainstream Asherites, motion and rest are just two different types of accidents.
Okay, how does that work?
Rest simply means God is creating an atom in place A for two successive frames. Frame 1, it's at A. Frame 2, it's at A.
Makes sense.
Motion simply means God creates an atom in place A in frame 1 and then creates it in place B in frame 2.
So there is no traveling at all.
None.
The object is just annihilated in one spot and recreated slightly to the left in the very next instant.
Exactly. And all of this incredibly complex granular physics, it served a higher purpose for them. It actually formed the bedrock of their ultimate proof for God.
The cosmological argument.
Yes. Known as a novitat mundum, an argument from the createdness or the novelty of the world.
Let's walk through the logic of that argument, because it ties everything together.
It's very clean once you accept their weird physics.
Mm-hmm.
Premise 1. We observe that the world is composed entirely of atoms and accidents. Premise 2. We have established logically that accidents cannot endure, they perish instantly.
Right.
Premise 3. An atom cannot exist without accidents, like color, shape, or location. Therefore, the atoms themselves are entirely contingent and fragile.
So since the entire universe is made of these fragile, flashing things that can't even sustain themselves for a single second, the universe itself cannot be eternal or self-sustaining.
Exactly. The sheer overwhelming contingency of this frame-by-frame universe logically demands a sustainer. It necessitates an external creator who sits outside of the time-space frame rate, constantly pumping existence into the system.
Man, their physics was just the ultimate defense mechanism for their theology.
It really was.
So by the 11th century, the Asherite theologians have built this impenetrable atomic fortress. They've turned reality into a divine strobe light just to protect God's power.
Right, but it was entirely a defensive strategy.
Yeah, because out in the wider intellectual world, the Islamic Neoplatonist philosophers were still thriving. They were still teaching that the universe was eternal, that it was driven by natural laws, and that philosophy was superior to revelation.
The theologians had built massive walls, but the philosophers were still outside laying siege. It wasn't until the late 11th century that someone came along who realized that just playing defense wasn't going to be enough.
Someone who decided to take the philosophers' own weapons, walk right into their camp, and burn their intellectual house down from the inside.
And that man was Abu Hamid al-Ghazali.
Al-Ghazali. And his story is one of the most fascinating psychological dramas in the history of thought.
Oh, Ghazali's an absolute titan. To really understand his impact, you have to understand his status at the time. He wasn't some fringe radical writing angry pamphlets. He was essentially a rock star academic of his era.
How big of a deal are we talking?
He was appointed to head the Nizamiya school in Baghdad, which was roughly equivalent to being the president of Harvard, Oxford, and MIT combined in the Islamic world at the time.
Wow. So he was teaching hundreds of students. He was the prime defender of Sunni orthodoxy against all these rival political and religious factions.
Right. He had wealth, prestige, massive influence. He was at the absolute zenith of his career.
And right at that peak, he suffers a complete catastrophic psychological and spiritual collapse.
It's a dramatic turn.
The notes pull from his autobiography, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, which means deliverance from error. And the physical symptoms he describes are genuinely harrowing. He literally loses the physiological ability to speak.
Yeah, he just freezes up.
He stands in front of his students and no words come out. His digestion fails. He says he can't swallow a single morsel of food. The doctors are completely baffled, and they eventually declare that the affliction is in his heart, not his body.
Because it was psychosomatic.
Exactly. He ends up abandoning his prestigious post, he gives away all his wealth, and he wanders as a mystic ascetic for years.
And what triggered this total physical breakdown was an intense, paralyzing crisis of epistemology, a profound crisis of doubt.
Like a midlife crisis, but about the nature of reality.
Yeah, Ghazali became utterly obsessed with the concept of certain knowledge. He realized that most of what he believed was just inherited, from his parents and his teachers.
Right.
He wanted knowledge so bulletproof, so absolutely foundational, that it could not be doubted under any circumstances whatsoever.
He sets a ridiculously high bar for himself here.
Yeah.
He says, okay, if I have certain knowledge that 10 is greater than 3, and a man comes along and says, no, 3 is greater than 10, and to prove it, I will turn this stick into a snake.
Right.
And the man actually does it. A literal miracle happens right in front of his eyes. Ghazali says, even then, my mind shouldn't doubt that 10 is greater than 3. I might marvel at the snake, but my mathematical knowledge must remain unshaken.
He is desperately searching for an anchor of truth. And his great tragedy was that when he began to rigorously test his own mind to find that anchor, he found he didn't actually have one.
He really anticipates the extreme skepticism of René Descartes, but like 5 centuries earlier.
Let's walk through his spiral of doubt because it is terrifyingly relatable. First, he tests the senses. He asks, can we trust what we see and hear?
And he quickly concludes that sensory data is inherently flawed. He uses some excellent examples for this.
Yeah, like the shadow on the sundial.
Exactly. You look at a shadow cast by a sundial. To your naked eye, it is perfectly stationary. There is no observable movement. But reason and time tell you it is actually in continuous motion as the sun moves across the sky.
Or looking at the night sky. Your eye tells you a star is roughly the size of a coin. But astronomical reason, math, proves that the star is vastly larger than the Earth.
So Ghazali says, well, if the senses lie to us about the shadow and the star, they are totally compromised. I cannot base my certain knowledge on eyesight.
So he just discards sensory knowledge entirely. He retreats to the intellect. He figures surely the necessary propositions of reason, axioms like a whole is greater than its part, surely those are safe, right?
But then his doubt turns into a virus that attacks reason itself. And he uses the dream analogy, which I think is just devastating.
It really is.
He thinks about the actual experience of dreaming. When you are in a dream, you might be flying or talking to someone who is dead. And in that moment, your dream logic tells you it is perfectly real and totally rational. You have absolute certainty.
Right. You never doubt it while you're in it.
Exactly. It is only when you wake up that your waking logic looks back and says, oh, that was an illusion.
Which raises the ultimate terrifying question for Ghazali. What if our waking life is just another dream?
Yes. What if there is some higher state of consciousness, maybe death, or some mystic state, and when we wake up into that state, we will look back at all our human math and logic and realize they were just the absurd, meaningless rules of a dream we were having?
It's the Matrix, basically.
Yeah, and if that is even possible, then reason itself cannot be trusted.
So he had completely dismantled his own reality. He writes that he was suspended in this void of absolute skepticism for nearly 2 months.
Just floating in doubt.
And crucially, he noted that he couldn't argue his way out of this trap, because to build an argument, you need foundational logic. And he had just destroyed his own trust in logic.
So how does he actually get out of it?
He credits it to a divine light infused into his heart by God. It wasn't a rational deduction that saved him. It was a state of grace, a mystic apprehension that basically restored his cognitive balance and his trust in foundational truths.
So he comes out of this crisis fundamentally changed. He is cured, but he has a new mission. He looks around at the intellectual landscape, he analyzes the different groups claiming to have the truth, and he zeroes in on the philosophers, the Islamic Neo-Platonists.
He decides they are the primary threat to the orthodox faith.
But here is where his genius truly shines. He knows that if you attack a logical system from the outside using theology, the philosophers will just laugh at you.
Right, because you're speaking a different language. To dismantle an intellectual edifice, you must first master its architecture better than the original architects did.
Right. So while he's still teaching his hundreds of students, he spends his spare time rigorously studying Greek philosophy. And he gets so good at it, he writes a book called The Intentions of the Philosophers.
And what's amazing is that it is simply a neutral, incredibly accurate summary of Neo-Platonic thought.
It was so brilliantly summarized that when it was later translated into Latin in Europe, Christian scholars actually thought Ghazali was a Neoplatonist himself.
They thought he was on the same team as Avicenna.
It is the ultimate mark of intellectual integrity. He fairly and accurately represented his opponent's arguments at their absolute strongest before he ever attempted to tear them down.
Which perfectly sets the stage for his masterpiece. Having written the playbook, he writes the rebuttal, Tahafut al-Falasifa, which translates to the incoherence of the philosophers.
Great title.
And his goal wasn't just to say, philosophy is bad. His goal was to prove that philosophy, when judged by its own strict logical standards, is inherently contradictory and incoherent.
And we should definitely highlight his nuance here. Ghazali did not issue a blanket condemnation of everything the Greeks taught.
No, not at all.
He explicitly praised disciplines like logic and mathematics, stating they were demonstrably true and entirely harmless to religion. He was a sniper. He wasn't a carpet bomber.
He specifically targeted physics and metaphysics, and he isolated 20 problematic propositions taught by the philosophers.
Right. 20 points of contention.
Right. And he categorized 17 of them as heresies.
Yeah.
Meaning they were heterodox, maybe bad ideas, but believing them didn't automatically kick you out of the Islamic faith.
But there were 3 left over.
Yes, 3 of these propositions he labeled as outright apostasy or kufr, meaning believing these 3 things meant you were no longer a Muslim.
Let's examine these 3 unforgivable philosophical sins because they perfectly illustrate the irreconcilable clash between a mechanical universe and an active creator.
Right, let's dive in. The first apostasy is the philosophical claim of the pre-eternity of the world.
Let's unpack this one. The Greek tradition, which was heavily influenced by Aristotle, argued that the universe has no beginning. It is eternal.
Right, it didn't start at a specific moment in time.
It has just always been emanating from God, naturally and necessarily, sort of like light eternally radiating from the sun.
And to Ghazali, this was entirely unacceptable because it destroys the concept of divine will.
How so?
Well, if the universe flows out of God automatically from all eternity, then God didn't make a conscious choice to create it ex nihilo out of nothing at a specific moment. It essentially reduces God from an active, deciding creator to just a passive, impersonal source.
And to destroy their argument for an eternal world, Ghazali actually uses their own beloved mathematics against them. This is one of my absolute favorite arguments in the text. I want to walk through the logic of this because it is stunning.
Please do, the planetary orbit argument.
Okay, so Ghazali says to the philosophers, you believe the universe is infinitely old. It has existed for an infinite amount of time. They say yes. So Ghazali says, that means the planets have been revolving around the sun for an infinite number of revolutions, correct?
Right, a logical consequence of their premise. Infinite past means infinite orbits.
But then Ghazali springs the trap, and he bases it on observable astronomy. He says, We know that Saturn takes roughly 30 years to complete one orbit. The Sun, or, a solar year from an Earth-centric view, takes 1 year to complete an orbit. Therefore, the Sun completes 30 orbits for every one orbit Saturn makes.
The sun is moving 30 times faster in terms of revolutions.
Exactly. So Ghazali asks, if the universe is infinitely old, Saturn has completed an infinite number of orbits. But the Sun has completed 30 times that infinity. How can one infinity be 30 times larger than another infinity?
It's brilliant.
And furthermore, he says, if you pause time right now, is the total number of planetary orbits in the universe an odd number or an even number?
It's just a devastating paradox. You cannot have an odd or even infinity. You cannot multiply an actual infinity by 30 and get a logically coherent result in the physical world.
Oh, I can just imagine the philosophers listening to this and pulling their hair out. He is using math to show that an infinitely old physical universe leads to mathematical absurdity. He proves that time must have had a starting point. It's a total mic drop moment.
It really is. And moving on to apostasy number 2, God's knowledge of particulars.
This one requires a bit of mental gymnastics regarding how the Greeks viewed perfection, right?
It does. The philosophers wanted to maintain the absolute purity and unchangeability of God. They argued that God is so elevated, he only knows universal abstracts.
Universal abstracts meaning what?
Meaning, he knows the concept of humanity, but he does not know you, the specific listener, existing right now in this moment.
That seems so counterintuitive for a religion. What's the Greek logic there?
The logic is that knowing a specific changing thing causes a change in the knower. If God knows that a solar eclipse is happening right now, and then an hour later knows that the eclipse has ended, God's state of knowledge has changed. And if God's state changes, he is not eternal and immutable. Therefore, to protect God's absolute perfection, he cannot know changing temporal particulars.
So he knows the blueprint of a house, but he doesn't know if the plumbing is leaking today.
Exactly.
Ghazali sees this and goes on the offensive.
Yeah.
He argues that this actually strips God of his actual divinity. Because if everything in the universe is just happening by natural necessity, and God doesn't even know the microscopic details of what's happening to Zaid or Amara, then God is basically a blind, deaf, dead mechanism.
And Ghazali counters their logic brilliantly. He argues that a change in the relationship to an object does not necessitate a change in the essence of the knower.
How does he explain that?
He says, look, if you are standing on my left and then you walk over and stand on my right, my relationship to you has changed. I now know you are on my right, but my fundamental essence hasn't mutated. I'm still me. Ghazali argued that God's eternal knowledge encompasses all particulars in a single, unchanging grasp. Denying this was, to Ghazali, insulting to God's omniscience.
Which brings us to the final unforgivable sin, apostasy 3, the denial of bodily resurrection.
The Greek philosophical tradition was deeply dualistic. They believed the spirit or the intellect was pure and eternal, but the physical body was a corrupt, temporal vessel, a prison for the soul.
So they didn't like bodies.
No. Therefore, they argued that the descriptions in the Quran of a physical afterlife, the gardens, the rivers, the physical pains of hell, were merely spiritual allegories meant to keep the uneducated masses in line. They said only the pure soul survives death.
And Ghazali says this is not just arrogant, it's logically weak. He counters that a dual enjoyment, both spiritual peace and physical pleasure, is perfectly coherent.
Right.
If you have already conceded that God is omnipotent and created the universe from nothing, why is it suddenly illogical that he could reassemble atoms and restore a soul to a physical body on the Day of Judgment? It's just another miraculous act.
Exactly. To deny it isn't based on logic. It's based on an elitist Greek bias against physical matter.
So, by declaring these 3 points apostasy, Ghazali drew a really hard line in the sand. But he realized that the root cause of all these philosophical errors, the denial of miracles, the eternal world, the distant God, it all stemmed from one foundational assumption.
Yes, causality.
To truly win the war, he had to destroy the engine of scientific philosophy itself. He had to dismantle causality.
And this is where we reach the absolute climax of Ghazali's argument. He goes after the causal nexus itself in question 17 of the Tahafut. He makes the incredibly audacious claim that there is zero necessary connection between a cause and an effect.
We really have to pause and appreciate how violently this clashes with human intuition, because we observe the world and we believe causality is the glue holding it all together. Like, if I drop a glass, gravity causes it to fall. The impact causes it to shatter.
The classic example Ghazali uses, which is very famous in philosophical circles, is fire and cotton.
Walk us through that.
He says, take a piece of cotton. and touch it to a flame. The cotton burns and turns to ash. Now, if you ask anyone, a scientist or a layman, what caused the cotton to burn, everyone will say, the fire.
And the Ghazali says, no, God burned the cotton. I hear what you're saying, but if I stick my hand in a fire, the fire is absolutely what burns me. How can he just deny such an obvious physical reality?
Well, he doesn't deny the event itself, he denies the mechanism. Ghazali argues that observation, just watching the event happen, only proves that the burning follows contact with the fire.
Okay.
It occurs alongside it. You see the fire touch the cotton, and you see the cotton turn black. But, he argues, you do not actually observe a hidden, invisible force called causality jumping out of the fire and entering the cotton.
So he's basically saying that correlation does not equal causation, but he's taking it to a metaphysical extreme.
Exactly. He is anticipating the exact arguments of the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume by roughly 700 years.
Wow, really?
Yeah, Hume would later rock the Western world by arguing that we only ever see constant conjunction events happening in sequence, but we never actually perceive a necessary connection.
So if the fire doesn't have an inherent independent power to burn the cotton, why does it always burn?
Ghazali's answer is that the correlation we see in nature is just a habit. It is a custom established by God.
A habit?
Yes, God is in the habit of creating the accident of burning whenever the cotton touches the fire.
Yeah.
We see it happen a million times, so our brains expect it, but God doesn't have to do it.
And this lays the perfect logical groundwork for miracles. Because if the laws of nature are not unbreakable physical constants, but merely the voluntary habits of a free creator, then a miracle is easily explained.
Exactly.
A miracle is just God deciding, for a brief moment, not to follow his usual habit.
The notes bring up the story of the prophet Abraham being thrown into the furnace by a tyrant. According to tradition, Abraham did not burn. Now, the philosophers would say this is a myth because fire must burn by its nature. But Ghazali says no, it's perfectly logical. When Abraham was in the fire, God simply withheld his habit.
He just chose not to do it that time.
Right. He decided not to create the accident of burning in that moment. Or maybe he created an accident of resistance in Abraham's body. The fire itself was powerless.
But Ghazali knows this invites a massive, practical counter-argument from his opponents.
Oh, absolutely, because it opens the door to complete uncertainty.
Because I'm thinking the exact same thing. If there are no necessary rules, if fire doesn't have to burn and water doesn't have to be wet, doesn't reality just dissolve into terrifying chaos?
That is the big fear, yes.
If God is just making it up frame by frame, I could leave a book on my desk, walk out to get a coffee, and come back to find my book has turned into a dog. Or a bowl of soup. How can humanity function if we can't rely on the laws of physics?
It is the ultimate anxiety of occasionalism. But Ghazali's defense here is incredibly elegant. He actually concedes that logically and metaphysically, yes, God absolutely could turn your book into a dog while you were out of the room.
Wait, he admits that?
Yes. There's nothing logically impossible about it.
Then why don't we walk around terrified all the time that our furniture is going to turn into wildlife?
Because, Ghazali argues, God is merciful, and he has created in human beings the knowledge that he will follow his habit. He has literally hardwired our consciousness to trust in the uniformity of his customs. We don't worry about the book turning into a dog because God has given us an innate assurance that he won't just arbitrarily break the script for no reason.
So we trust the habit, even while acknowledging it could be broken.
Precisely. And this framework allows Ghazali to explain some of the most dramatic miracles without breaking logic at all. He introduces the concept of God telescoping, or bridging, the normal process of change.
I love this concept. It frames miracles not as a violation of nature, but as basically fast-forwarded nature.
Take the generation of life, for example. Under the normal habit of God, it's a long sequential process.
Right, it takes time.
Earth turns into vegetation over months. An animal eats the vegetation and digests it into blood. The blood is transformed into seminal fluid. The fluid gestates and becomes an offspring. It is a long, habitual chain of permutations.
But when a prophet performs a miracle like Moses throwing down his wooden staff and it instantly turning into a living serpent, Ghazali says, we shouldn't view this as a logical impossibility.
Right, it's not a glitch in the matrix.
God is simply taking that long, habitual process of permutations, wood to earth, to vegetable, to blood, to animal, and telescoping it into a split second. He basically hits the fast-forward button on his own cosmic habit.
It is just a breathtakingly cohesive system. He managed to harmonize a universe that feels orderly and predictable to us with a theology of a God who is totally unconstrained and absolutely
It's
free.
incredible.
He defeated the philosophers not by rejecting their logic, but by outlogicking them.
He completely beat them at their own game. And looking back at the incredible intellectual distance we've covered today, it's just staggering.
It really is a massive journey.
We started with al-Shari, an established scholar literally throwing away his career because he realized human logic couldn't contain divine justice. We watched the Asharite theologians build an atomic, 60 frame per second quantum metaphysics where everything perishes instantly just to protect God's sovereignty.
And we culminated with al-Ghazali, who suffered a complete epistemological breakdown only to emerge and systematically deconstruct the eternal mechanical universe of the Greek philosophers, turning causality itself into nothing more than a divine habit.
The relevance of this, even if you are listening to this 1,000 years later and you don't personally subscribe to Islamic theology, is profound. This deep dive forces us to interrogate our most basic assumptions about reality. When scientists today look at quantum mechanics, at particles popping in and out of existence, at the collapse of the wave function based on observation, they are brushing up against the very limits of causality that Ghazali was writing about in the 11th century. It forces us to ask, what actually are the laws of nature? Are they unbreakable, eternal truths? Or are they just the habits of a universe we're only beginning to understand?
It fundamentally humbles our intellectual arrogance, I think, which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Let's hear it.
If Ghazali and the Asharites are right, if continuous reality is an illusion, and our world is actually a series of disconnected, discrete moments held together only by an invisible external will, how does that change your perception of your own agency today?
That's the real question.
When you reach out your hand right now to touch a desk or your phone or a steering wheel, is the connection you feel a hard, unyielding physical law? Or is it just a deeply ingrained habit of the universe, a habit that, in the very next microsecond, could change completely?
A perfectly unsettling question to leave you with. Thank you for taking this custom-tailored deep dive into the source material with us. Keep questioning the habits of your universe, and we'll see you next time.